I'm here today to talk about the pseudo-religion followed by a number of scientists, engineers, and businessmen whose ideas I really do not like. And I hope to convince you that you also shouldn't like their ideas. I believe their projects are extremely dangerous, uncritical, Frankensteinian, selfish, deceptive, and I don't think they should receive funding, or at the very least, the funding they receive should, well, ought to go to scientists, engineers, etc., who don't justify what they do merely with the explanation of, because I can. However, since I only have 12 to 15 minutes, I'm necessarily going to truncate this presentation to focus on just one scientist, well, one engineer and his funder. And for the sake of time, I've removed from this presentation most of the close readings, the visual analysis, the comparisons to analogous dystopian sci-fi, all the meaty stuff one might expect at a literature conference. Not serving it today. One antagonist is rather easy. Is Jeff Bezos, who funds this sort of stuff and is profoundly interested in life extension, immortality, and various expensive phallic-shaped hobbies. Our primary antagonist, however, the main subject of this presentation, though not nearly as bad as Stuart Brand, as Jeff Bezos, is the self-proclaimed Mary prankster and eco-pragmatist, Stuart Brand. Stuart Brand lives on a houseboat, and that's important for reasons I'll explain later. And he spent the latter years of his life organizing a sort of boys club known as the Long Now Foundation, which is attended to by a number of other problematic folks like Alexander Rose, Dan Hillis, Brian Eno, and Jeff Bezos. All of them kind of share this quality of being aging, male, white, rich, powerful, self-satisfied, balding, terrified of death, and determined to live forever. These are the congregants of the new Technical Church of the Long Now. The Long Now has a clubhouse in San Francisco where Stuart Brand and his friends host talks, discuss BattleBots, drink, and plan their flagship project, the Clock of the Long Now. I say that emphasizing the spontaneous nature of the phrase. Also known as the 10,000-year clock. This is literally a 500-foot tall clock meant to tick once a year, talk once a century, cuckoo every millennium, and inspire an ethics of 10,000-year thinking. That is, what decisions would you make? Or wouldn't you make were you to consider the ramifications of those decisions 10,000 years into the future? In many ways, from the perspective of we denizens of the dismal Anthropocene, the idea of a 10,000-year ethic is a welcome one. It is tremendously hopeful to imagine the Earth with us projected so far into the future to apply glacial thinking to social, political, environmental, and economic policy, to consider from such a zoomed-out perspective how one might reweight one's pendulum values. Sufficiently zoomed out, as the clock asks us to do, we are put into a temporal space so large that what remains visible at such temporal heights reflects the accomplishments of human beings as a whole. The clock asks us to think like beings who live for expanses of time far exceeding the 70-some years allotted to the average human lifespan, to consider how society might change if people were to live long enough to experience the ramifications of their decisions and not simply abdicate responsibility for those decisions with the convenient excuse of death. But it is also a thought experiment that becomes remarkably problematic when moved from the laboratory of the mind, the thought experiment, into a remote, colossal, at least 501-foot deep mountain cave in Nevada. At this point, the question of the ethics of the imaginary time-bending clock butts up against the means of its creation and impels consideration of whether the lessons learned from the idea of the clock are antithetical to the clock made real. They are. Just what is this clock, and can we square the ethics of long now thinking with the values of Jeff Bezos, whose major financial backer who is the major financial backer of this project, and whose greatest gift to this planet has been Amazon 2-day Prime. In a letter to shareholders written from after Amazon's 1997 breakout year, Bezos explains his business values. It's all about the long term, he says. He keeps saying long term over and over again. 5 pages, 11 times, long term thinking. Can a 10,000-year ethic be squared with a 2-day one? Or is it a sort of apology for his own role in this climate crisis? Or has Bezos, like some 20th, 21st century Ozymandias, made a bid at his own immortality by building this monument to himself, a giant phallic-shaped clock, or cock, penetrating a 500-foot deep cave meant to last for all eternity? The same can be asked for Stuart Brand, progenitor of the whole Earth catalog, and more recently with the techno-capitalist environmentalism he calls eco-pragmatism and eco-modernism. Can environmentalism be understood as a venture capital opportunity? Just what does Stuart Brand mean by the subtitle of his book? Responsibility, time and responsibility. Who precisely is responsible, and for what are they responsible? In the whole Earth discipline, Brand, and I point out at the very top, one of the most important green tracks since Silent Spring. That's quite a claim. In the whole Earth discipline, Brand restates what was the technophilic model of the whole Earth catalog. Originally, his claim was, we are as gods, and we might as well get good at it. Now, 30 years later, Brand tweaks his motto slightly. We are as gods, and we have to get good at it. His faith in the future of human beings a century hence, or 10 millennia hence, is in technology. He would tell us that it is our collective, and these are his words, obligation to learn planetcraft, to hack civilization, to finesse climate before it finesses us, and I won't get into the etymology of finesse, it's very strange. For Stuart Brand, nature is seen in binaries: human versus nature, control or be controlled, dominate or be dominated, finesse or be finessed. If there's a question of whether the role of human beings in relation to nature is one of dominion or if it is one of stewardship, Brand leans heavily away from the position with which he shares his name and his brand. Brand's primary critiques of environmentalists, and I have to stress that environmentalists are not eco-pragmatists, is this. Environmentalists are wrong about urbanization, they're wrong about nuclear energy, they're wrong about technology in general. There he is. Brand would anticipate that nuclear waste can be stored for future generations to use with an as yet not discovered technology as a power source. Global warming can be solved or deferred by emitting reflective powders into the sky to artificially lower the Earth's temperature or reflecting more sunlight, an event that naturally occurs during volcanic eruptions. The idea of simulating a man-made volcanic eruption in order to induce a global winter would give most people pause. If the volcano strategy doesn't work, there's always option B, which Brand proposes in all seriousness, and I might call it the Mr. Burns strategy. Launch a giant web of satellites in orbit between Earth and the Sun to control how much sunlight hits the planet. Brand is not alone in his technical convictions. These strategies reflect the lengths eco-pragmatists or eco-capitalists will go to preserve the current system of consumption. By Brand's panegyric estimations, the per capita efficiency of cities is the solution to population problems. Notably, he breaks from his former advisor, Paul Ehrlich, who wrote the neo-Malthusian alarmist bestseller, Population Bomb. Stuart Brand is staunchly anti-population control, which is the main subject of a recent anxious nativist sophist book by Matthew Iglesias, 1 Billion Americans. Brand and the technophiles hold as a core tenet of their religion the belief in the power of technology to automatically provide the answers to any future problems that might threaten the species Homo sapiens sapiens. As my colleague Lisa Sedaris pointed out, this position is actually quite similar to what many evangelical Christians believe, that the right technology, especially new forms of energy, will magically appear at the right moment, just when we need it, sort of providential view. The population, he estimates, is already beginning to decline, or rather the rate that the population was increasing is decelerating. If everyone simply moved to cities and we, his words, green the hell out of the growing cities, the detrimental impact of human beings would be reduced to the necessary minimum, affecting an insignificant footprint on the Earth's surface. The rest of the planet could be left to regreen itself and replenish its biodiversity, though how precisely it is unclear. There's a lot of faith in pragmatism. Faith in cornucopianism, faith in the cornucopianism, the optimistic belief that somehow there will always be enough resources to go around. Faith in capitalist market pressure to drive forward his anticipated but not yet developed innovation, just as environmental pressures select for various evolutionary traits. Brand imagines that so too the pressures of global warming will select for better and worse technological solutions and encourage allocation of resources to the better ones. The faithful eco-pragmatist has nothing to fear from the environmental crisis to come. Rather, it is an opportunity, a chance to prospect on apocalypse. One must have faith in the just-in-timeness of these solutions, faith in the deus ex machina, faith that the clock of the long now may somehow decelerate with great acceleration, and somehow turn back the clock, so to speak, on extinction and global warming. Brand's solution to every crisis is more engineering, which is perhaps what we should expect in the matter of Maslow's hammer when we ask an engineer for a solution to global warming. Brand would tell us that global warming very well might be a good business opportunity. The clock of the long now is explicitly meant to be a temple of time. We're meant to travel to it, to a pilgrimage to it. We hopefully are meant to go and worship at it and consider our smallness in relation to its enormous temporal girth. Given it is a temple, I would ask this. When you prostrate yourself before the temple of time, and here we have Sara Judy before one of the prototypes. That's actually just a raincoat, but it's pretty funny how much this looks like he's dressed up as a monk. Just who are we worshiping? Are we worshiping time or are we worshiping brand? The long now foundation, the clock of the temple, the unavoidable phallic comparisons, Brand's excellent branding, all put him in the position of the mythic progenitor of this pseudo-religion. He is just one small step from becoming another L. Ron Hubbard. Or at the very least, he has anticipated how easily such an apotheosis could occur over the course of a few decades, 100 years of cultural amnesia. Such stuff, after all, is a common trope of science fiction. Brand doesn't stall with the call to time. He believes that de-extinction is a useful avenue for scientific exploration. He believes that with all the confidence of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, or Victor Frankenstein sparking life into a monster he subsequently refuses to take responsibility for. Brand, in a doubly hubristic act, would tell us that he can solve the problems of mass extinction simply by the powers of his own intellect, or at the very least, the powers of his collaborative intellect with his colleagues. For example, the Harvard biologist George Church, whose primary interest is de-extinction, particularly of the woolly mammoth. Church is also interested in resurrecting the Neanderthal, and is actively looking for women to be surrogates for the cause. No, I don't think it's a surprise that George Church has ties to Jeffrey Epstein. And yet, both Church and Brand miss the important lesson of the story of Lazarus. These resurrected, de-extinct species are called Lazarus species, and they give way to a different reading of the details of the story of Jesus resurrecting Lazarus. The story is quite dark when considered from the perspective of Lazarus. Jesus let Lazarus die. He did not think to spare Lazarus the pain of having died, nor did the idea seem to have occurred to him. And then Jesus waited 4 days for Lazarus' body festered in a cave. Only when Jesus is challenged by his followers, explicitly, does the idea of the miracle seem to have occurred to him, not for the sake of Lazarus, not because it's necessarily right, but and I quote, "For the benefit of the people here, that they," Jesus' followers, "believe that you," he's talking to God, sent me, Jesus, right? Jesus has no agent, or Lazarus has no agency here. The whole point of the resurrection is to prove the divinity of the resurrector. The book of John tells us nothing about what happens to Lazarus after this point, but one might infer that Lazarus, resurrected into his old, failing body, would have to suffer and die all over again. Jesus killed Lazarus twice, simply to prove his own power. This has been the case with every de-extincted animal so far. They've all lived for like 10 minutes. This is also perhaps the reason that the extinction biologists choose the sexiest species. Mans, dodo birds, passenger pigeons to resurrect, right? Brand himself knows, and these are his words, he said this, "Preventing extinction is a bargain compared to reversing extinction. If the passenger pigeons are brought back, what is to stop us from eating them again? But doing the hard work necessary to preventing the death of the species does not fill eco-pragmatist narcissism. The technophilic solutions, instead, like de-extinction, shooting sulfates into the atmosphere, constructing giant clocks, are all self-aggrandizing pet projects of hyper-wealthy technophiles, hoping to secure their legacy as benevolent great men by dressing up their hobbies in the language of environmentalism." Once asked how working on the great clock affected him, the then septuagenarian Brand replied with what must have been an understatement. He said, it's made getting old fun. Rather, it's made getting more fun. Last question for this. What belongs in the future that Brand imagines? I'm quite certain it isn't anyone in this room. Certainly not me. It seems to be only rich survivalists, those wealthy white male technophiles who have made a hobby of preparing themselves for protection from a myriad apocalypses. Survivalists build bunkers far away from city centers and imagine elaborate ways of squatulating to their secret safe zones, stocked full of food and guns in the event of a nuclear catastrophe or whatever. Brand himself lives on a 64-foot tugboat, converted into a home, safe from, and again, he admits this really, safe from, these are his words, safe from the problems with earthquakes, wildfires, or rising sea levels due to global warming. It is the awful irony that the very people who are profiting from the apocalypse are the very people who are best equipped to survive it, something that is the subject of the recent film, Don't Look Up. This is part of the tragic irony that the very people who would ask us to think in terms of the long now, the big here, who would ask us to engage in long-term thinking, are the very people who would in fact rather control time. And I don't just mean in terms of Amazon 2-day Prime, but the very conditions of the warehouses, the inhumane, humiliating wage slavery schedules of the Amazon warehouses. For all its moralizing, the one thing that is clear from the Long Now Foundation is that the ethics of long-term thinking need not be separated from the basic tenets of capitalism. Reflecting on the clock, I wonder to what extent it is a future monument meant to invoke humility in the face of a gigantic temporal sublime, or if it is a self-congratulatory monument celebrating the aspirations of a handful of aging engineers and billionaires, reassuring themselves by imagining their own obsolescence as an apotheosis. Long-term thinking is expensive. Not everybody can afford it. Future thinking is a privilege of the rich, and humility, responsibility, that's for the rest of us. Thank you.